Keynote lunch talk, I'm going to propose to Radwan and our board that next year, if possible, we have the next conference in Syria. Syria is an emerging, hopefully democracy, inshallah. 54 years of one family rule has come to an end. We have Radwan Ziyada on our board, and so it would be great to have next year's conference in Syria. And then, if possible, the year after that, I want to propose that we have the conference in 2 years in Jerusalem. Next year in Jerusalem, hopefully in an environment where everyone from the river to the sea can live in equality, regardless of religion or ethnicity. That's the aspiration that I think many of us share in terms of what's happening today in historic Palestine. So it's a great honor and privilege for me to introduce today's keynote speaker, Sarah Leah Whitson, who I've known for a very long time. Sarah Leah Whitson is the executive director of DAWN, an organization that seeks to support democracy and human rights in the Middle East, critically to hold abusers accountable, to reform U.S. Middle East policy. Previously, she had the distinguished position of being the executive director of the Middle East and North Africa division of Human Rights Watch, where she oversaw 19 different countries and many employees, and she sort of, that's how I got to know her work. She sort of had that position where she led that position with distinction, honor. I sort of envision that for Sarah Leah, that a future job for her after she's done with this one would be a position along the lines of the UN Human Rights High Commissioner, or possibly a future prosecutor at the International Criminal Court. She's a public intellectual. She is an activist. She's also, I want to announce, the author of a forthcoming new book with Michael Omerman called From Apartheid to Democracy, a blueprint for peace in Israel and Palestine, to be published later this year by University of California Press. We're going to hope to have a book launch for her at Georgetown. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I can't think of a better person to come to a conference such as this one to speak about the challenges of authoritarianism, not just in the Middle East, but here in the United States and around the world, than Sarah Leah Whitson. Please join me in welcoming her today.
Thank you, Nader, for that, and good to see all of you guys. But is this close enough? Thank you in particular to CSID and Radwan Masmoudi. I'm honored to be here on the 23rd anniversary. And Radwan, your commitment, your dedication, your perseverance are an inspiration to all of us, but particularly to me. So thank you for this work and bringing us all together. We are together in a very, very dark time. Amid the genocide in Gaza, there really is no room to speak of democracy and human rights. They seem a luxury, a decadent and unattainable distraction from what cannot but be our first priority and focus of our attention: to save the people of Palestine from the savage Israeli slaughter underway, to save, yes, even the Israeli people from the curse of being a genocidal nation. For those of us here in the United States, this is our greatest responsibility because of our own government's essential role in enabling Israeli crimes. The atrocities in Gaza have lowered the bar on what is imaginable and permissible in the region for people demanding their rights. The new threat that now lingers for those disrupting their oppression is outright extermination, making the crimes of General Sisi and Mohammed bin Salman seem quaint in comparison. The champions of freedom and democratic rule, thousands upon thousands, still languish in jail throughout the Middle East today, watching the genocide in Gaza. It makes me pause to wonder if this genocide might not have taken place, if it could have been stopped, were the Middle East to have actual democracies instead of dictatorships ruling the entire region, to put their collective weight in the region to persuade, pressure, or punish Israel into ending its crimes, or even to end the catastrophic civil war in Sudan, instead of fueling it with weapons to the worst culprits. Only one Arab state has taken concrete action to sanction Israel: the Houthi-led government of Yemen, itself rife with gross abuses against the Yemeni people. We know that many of these Arab states have the power and influence to act, particularly as a collective in the otherwise useless Arab League. Instead, because they remain reliant on American protection, they've exchanged normalization with Israel, either under the Camp David architecture or the more modern iteration of the Abraham Accords, with the bill paid for by the Palestinian people. It's pretty remarkable today that we find ourselves pinning our hopes on Mohammed bin Salman, the sadistic sociopath leading Saudi Arabia, to use his financial power as leverage against Israel. To date, Saudi Arabia has held back on normalization, but taken no concrete action to ending the war, much less the military occupation of Palestine. The stark reality, as I stated at a conference last week commemorating 15 years since the Arab uprisings, is that there are no Arab democracies. Iran and Israel, not Arab states, are the only states where there is some measure of democratic rule, with a simple rule of thumb that we don't know who will be the president or prime minister in the country before the election. Much of Arab youth and talent, indeed global youth and talent, now flock gratefully to the mesmerizing riches and financial opportunities in the Gulf states, seeing no value in their worth as citizens, in their freedom of speech, in their right to democratic governance. Material wealth appears to be the only aspiration available to the lucky few who make it to the petrodollar states. The dictatorial monarchies are today among the biggest investors in global markets and businesses, with foreign leaders, CEOs, heads of institutions falling over themselves to woo Saudi, Emirati, Qatari cash with nary a hint of displeasure at their autocratic rule. Meanwhile, the economies in much of the rest of the region are pauperized, stripped bare by the plundering ruling elites. Some years ago, in early 2014, I met with Saif al-Islam Gaddafi when he was being detained by the Zintan militia. He had been indicted and an arrest warrant had been issued by the International Criminal Court for his role in violently suppressing the democratic uprising in Libya. When I asked him about his treatment and detention, noting the laws of due process designed to protect even him, he remarked at the time, "What law? What human rights? I only see the law of the jungle." More than 10 years later, it's hard not to see his vision a reality. Gaza has become the graveyard of international law, as Raji Sourani, the head of the Gaza-based Palestinian Center for Human Rights, recently remarked. Not only has Israel's genocide in Gaza, aided and abetted by the United States, the United Kingdom, and Germany, among others, exposed the West's fraudulent commitment to human rights, it has undermined the rule of law and human rights in Western countries themselves. Our own freedom of speech, our own freedom of protest, our academic freedom have been sacrificed for the cause of protecting Israel from criticism. Our own democracies have been shown to be autocracies when it comes to Israel, where the mass popular support for Palestinian rights in every Western country, including the United States, has had virtually no reflection in the policies of our governments, which continue to aid and abet the genocide. What tyrant anywhere in the world will feel even remotely restrained by the international rules-based order, including the edifice of international justice, the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, if Western leaders have abandoned the rules themselves? We must take particular pause to reflect on the role of the United States in the Middle East, given its role as the global superpower with the greatest presence and influence in the region among the nations in the world. Despite the extensive, if now expired, rhetoric of the United States government's commitment to democracy promotion, its role in the Middle East has always been one of democratic suppression, supporting abusive dictatorships, whether dressed up as presidencies or monarchies or emirates, with its military protection. Whatever the millions in spending of USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, etc., for various democracy and civil society projects, the overwhelming power and influence of the United States, particularly the billions in U.S. weapons and the political protection that go with it, have been used to support and defend the very undemocratic regimes in Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Qatar. This U.S. support is primarily a result of the perception that democracy would be bad for U.S. interests, risking our control over pliable dictatorships and monarchs who can be bought with the promise of security protection. These U.S. interests have been narrowly defined, accepted as unchallenged scripture by the foreign policy elites, as securing the free flow of cheap, dirty fossil fuels, securing Israeli impunity, and maintaining U.S. hegemony, particularly military hegemony in the region vis-à-vis its global competitors. We've also seen massive corruption by way of the military-industrial complex, the pro-Israel oligarchs and lobbies, and increasingly the wealthy Arab regimes themselves, who have not just gotten in on the game, but become the champions, creating a perverse incentive system to always reward American officials for doing the wrong thing for the people of the region, supporting wars and militarization, death and destruction for decades. This corruption, and it's important to call it what it is now more naked and exponentially greater than ever before. But let's not pretend that this is something Trump or the Republicans created. No Democratic administration, not Clinton, not Obama, and certainly not Biden, took any material steps to curb this corruption that has now reached epidemic levels in our own government. Rather than the Middle East becoming more democratic under the influence of so-called U.S. democracy promotion, the U.S. has become more like the hereditary dictatorships of the Middle East, distributing largesse to friends and family, and operating the entire country as their own family business. While George Bush briefly detoured into some gestures of democracy promotion in Egypt and, ironically, Palestine, when the results produced outcomes that threatened their influence, the democracy promotion project was quickly abandoned. Some justified Bush's war in Iraq in the name of democracy and human rights, but I think we're well past the point of needing to rebut those well-debunked lies, and of course Iraq remains a perpetually near-failed state. President Biden was perhaps the end of the era of America's democracy promotion rhetoric. He arrived touting an alliance of democracies, promising to end the blank checks for Egypt's dictators and weapons to pariah Saudi Arabia, but soon found himself groveling for Mohammed bin Salman's and Saudi's largesse, debasing himself and our country before the entire world with his servile little fist bump. Many in the region felt abandoned, believing that Biden would be different, that he would change course and genuinely support democracy in the region. I did not share their hope or optimism about President Biden because it was very clear that he remained as beholden to Israel and its backers, as devoted to the Gulf states and their dollars, as loyal to the defense companies profiting like jackals on Arab corpses, as intoxicated by U.S. primacy and control as his predecessors. President Trump's speech in Riyadh marked an abandonment of this fictional rhetoric, which felt fresh in its candor. The U.S. was in town to do business, and the human rights abuses were mere sins of the heart. That's cheers to you, Mohammed, that the United States had no business meddling in. Of course, his speech came with its own distortion, conveniently lumping the regime change Western interventionists, nation builders, and neocons with the liberal nonprofits spending trillions failing to develop Kabul and Baghdad, and lecturing on how to govern your own affairs, as if the people in the region have any say in how their affairs are governed. Certainly, Trump's critique was not an entirely unfair one. Those champions of military intervention in the name of democracy and human rights, like recent USAID Administrator Samantha Power, but also some in the human rights movement itself, who are ready to self-immolate, demanding military intervention in Syria, for example, have much to answer for, particularly in the face of their silence on calling for any intervention in Gaza, because their failures have now given Trump the justification to discard the entirety of the human rights agenda. It bears repeating, however, that many of us never asked the United States to promote democracy or drop bombs on civilians in the name of human rights. We have simply asked our government to get its fist off the scale in favor of dictators, to do no harm, to end its military and political support for abusive regimes, so that the people of the region have a fair shot at freedom. No, we as Americans, I do not believe, have a responsibility to create democracy in the Middle East or fix the broken, corrupt regimes there. Perhaps we owe reparations to many peoples in the region. We most certainly, however, have a legal, moral, and national responsibility to stop supporting tyranny and genocide. The outlook is bleak, and I'm sorry to have to be the messenger of such bad news. I have struggled to find the sources of hope for democracy and rights in these dark times, not just in the region, but in the world. At this moment, these values seem like a blip, themselves an anomaly in history, where we now seem to be reverting to imperial zones of influence that preceded the short democratic experiment after a brief heyday of a liberal world order. But there are a few things that remain on the side of what is good for humanity, for freedom, for democracy. First, we may be seeing cracks in the Israeli diktat in the region, wedded to war and destabilization for so long. Hamas's October 7 attacks on the region, cruel and unlawful in their targeting of civilians, was nevertheless a game changer for the region, forcing a reckoning on the question of Palestine that had been completely erased from discussion as Arab states wished to pretend they no longer existed. And as I noted in October 2023, when this most heinous chapter of the long war on Palestine commenced, Israel's goal has been and continues to be to expel or exterminate all Palestinians in Palestine and to destroy all regimes and forces it sees as obstacles, from Hezbollah to Syria to Iran. The Biden administration was marching lockstep with these goals, and war with Iran felt inevitable. The Trump administration, to its credit, has shaken up this status quo approach in the region, sending important signals that it is breaking with Israel's chokehold over U.S. policy in the region, pursuing foreign policy goals without Israeli approval or veto. Iran diplomacy, ending the war against the Houthis with a commitment only about attacks on U.S. ships, which is where we were before, negotiating with Hamas to secure release of an American citizen, lifting sanctions on Syria, pressuring Israel to allow in a tiny bit of aid, and apparently an imminent temporary ceasefire, what passes for progress these days. Perhaps this is more a reflection of the Gulf states outspending the pro-Israel oligarchs, spending more to avert war with Iran and cool support for Israel. None of these reflect a shift to democracy or human rights, but they introduce a long overdue measure of decoupling U.S. policy from Israeli interests, as my colleague Raj Jarrad has recently written. They reduce the risk of war with Iran and a broader war in the region, which is, of course, tremendously important for the physical survival of the people's region. With the growing global opposition to Israel and shifts in European policy now seeking to find some ways to sanction Israel, there may come a point where the decoupling from Israel intensifies and Israel finds itself more isolated and alone and seeks to find an alternative approach, a way out. In the Middle East, Israel remains the outlier, the single greatest liability for the United States in its endless conflicts and belligerence. The book I've just written, which Nader kindly referenced, presents such an off-ramp for Israel should its people seek to end the status quo of global revulsion and isolation, setting out a transitional plan for, first, how to end occupation and apartheid, and second, to allow the people from the river to the sea to decide how they wish to be governed, whether in one state, in two states, or some other model. The most important point to emphasize, however, is that it is possible and it is doable to solve this man-made problem. The volatility and unknown remain a source of hope for us. Just as the Arab uprisings caught the world by surprise, the darkest forces in the world are no less subject to the forces of change than the brightest ones. As we've all seen, dictatorships are very, very stable until they're not. We need one successful model of democracy in the Arab world to set the path and serve as a model. This is why what happens next in Syria is so important and invaluable opportunity, not just for the Syrian people, but for all of the people of the region. Because most of all, I find hope in the people. Today, I find hope in the Palestinians whose settlers continue to try to displace but remain rooted in their homes. The Iranians behind bars in Evin who still find ways to write and dissent. In the Egyptian youth harassed by Sisi's forces but who still speak out for change. And especially in our own backyards, I find hope in the students who still protest despite the political witch hunts. The reporters, the writers, the organizers, the teachers, and the leaders who chose to stay and show up and keep up their work. Their determination to freedom should inspire us at all. Their courage in the shadows teaches us all. We have, because at our core, a very human instinct for justice and for freedom. We have a hope that a new generation will follow the exhausted generation and have no memory of the suffering that they've endured. As my friend Dr. Issam Homesh reminds me, we choose hope. It's an action we take, but it's always a choice. Because when we are faced with injustice and cruelty, as he wrote, we choose justice, fairness, kindness, and love. Because when we are faced with darkness and senseless violence, we choose life, human dignity, and the courage to defend and resist. We choose it because it is most befitting of our beliefs, of who we are, of our outlook on life, of our definition of our purpose in life, and what makes our time on this planet honorable. For some, for Dr. Homesh, this is the divine secret. For me, it is my faith in righteous humans that we will prevail. This is our journey, this is our challenge, this will be our story. We are going to stand up and count, no matter what the outcomes, because it's the right thing to do. Thank you.